I don't know how to screen share, Aiden.
So there's a button on the bottom bar that says share screen.
No. Oh, there it is. It's green. We're good. Sorry. I am fully a boomer. Okay, it's in this window. We're getting to it. Cool. Can someone just like confirm that they can see this on the screen share?
Yes.
Thank you, Aiden. Okay, cool. So this is my presentation on how to MO. I'm Katrina. I'm a Tufts Dino. I graduated from Tufts in 2023. For those of you that do not know me, I MO'd a lot. I was a PMMO. I did LO for a bit and then was like, the MO is for me. So I have a lot of thoughts on MOing. I did it a lot as a debater, and it is something that's very fun. And I think a lot of people underestimate the importance of and like the versatility of the position. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the basics of what the MO is. We're going to talk about giving a pretty basic MO, and we'll go into some of the strategies you can use in the MO. And then if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them at the end. So what are the basics of giving an MO? The MO has a couple responsibilities. Obviously, it is the fourth and final constructive speech of the round, right before rebuttal speeches start. It's an 8-minute, 30-second speech, just like the other, like the LOC and the MG. And it is important in that it is the last chance to make new arguments before you go into rebuttals and before you go into op block. So, or before you go into, or it is the beginning of op block, but like before you go into rebuttals. So it is important that it's the last chance to respond to the gov case for op, because you cannot make new arguments in LOR. And it is also just the last speech in the round that is able to make meaningfully new arguments besides like the PMR responding to MO arguments. So what are the responsibilities then of the MO? You need to respond to content directly out of the MG, i.e. if the MG goes and says a bunch of new stuff, it's the MO's job to respond to that and make sure it's not reappearing in PMR as a vote error. Secondarily, it is to clean up the flow, i.e. the MO exists to go about the flow and say, what got messy? What do we need to clean up? What do we need to clarify or make more simple going into rebuttal speeches? Because you can do a lot of work to make it much easier for your LO and LOR to say, we're winning this. If you do a lot of the work to straighten out like what arguments apply where, what the clash looks like, what the weighing is, etc. Third, it exists to strengthen the existing op arguments or introduce new op content. You have the ability to weigh and impact like a rebuttal speech in the MO, but you also have the ability to make new arguments while you are doing it. That is why the MO is really fun at a basic level, because not only can you say, here's an argument, here's why we're winning it, here's why it's really important, like a PMR or an LOR can, you also get to say, here's new warrants for why the argument is true, and no one can point of order you because you are allowed to make them in the MO. This means then it's kind of like a hybrid between a PMR or a rebuttal and a constructive speech. When I would MO, I would usually think through my arguments in that sort of way. So I would think to myself, how can I structure this argument in a way that the judge can listen to this out of the MO and say, yeah, that's probably winning, because you have the ability to set things up as voters while also being able to have them set up and make new contributions to the round. The simplest version of the MO that you can possibly give basically just goes line by line. That is to say, you can get up and give an MO that is perfectly good and perfectly winning, that follows the flow in the same order the MG did, responds to everything the MG said, maybe adds 1 or 2 new lines of analysis to it, and you just take out gov ballots before PMR and properly rebuild LOC ballots. That's a perfectly good, it's probably a winning MO if you do it well. That said, there's also a lot of room to get fancy with it and have fun with style when you're giving an MO, because it is a speech that's really versatile. Finally, the last thing I will say is that there's a common belief on APTA that like the MO is for people who don't like to LO, or the MO is for people who like don't have the ability to content generate to be an LO. This is just not true. There are very different skills that are involved in MOing, and there's also a lot of strategy and a lot of room to play with it. So I think getting away from thinking of the MO and being like, oh, the MO is like a secondary LO, like you have to do less prep, you have to do less work, is good. One, that it's just not true, but two, in that it means you're going to think differently about the MO and how you are giving it. And you are more likely to give like better, stronger, more winning MOs if you're not thinking of yourself as necessarily secondary to your LO. Cool. All of that said, how do I give an MO is probably the next question that you are thinking. We will start with something called an on-flow MO rather than the off-flow MO that you will hear referenced by debaters a lot. It's a lot easier to give. It's a lot easier to understand structurally. So we're going to start there. A couple things you should do if you are going to be MOing. You should set yourself up for success. There are a couple ways to do that. And it is important that you are thinking from the beginning of the round and it is not hitting MG and you are like, fuck, I got to give an MO. That's not going to set you up well. So what can you do? First, you need to be thinking brain active during POCs. Yes, really, yes. People who know me will think this is a joke because I was known to sit there during POCs and look like I wasn't doing anything. That said, you should be doing something. Either make sure you understand case. So if it's complicated, ask Gov questions yourself, clarify background, ensure you understand what's going on around you. Two, make sure that I confused myself. Ensure you understand what's going on, prep things for the round. So if you want to prep overviews or you want to be prepping things, like you want to be thinking of possible responses or thinking of where the Gov case is going to go. 3, help your LO. If you can be helping your LO prep arguments, you can be helping them write stuff, you can be on a Google Doc starting to figure out what they need. These are all things you can do during POCs that are going to be really helpful to you, and rather than just like sitting there chilling. 2, something that's really helpful is flowing really well. I don't really care what it is. People flow lots of different ways. You can flow on a spreadsheet, you can flow on paper, you can flow on a Google Doc straight down as people say things, but finding a way to flow that works for you is really important, because it is important that you are finding ways that you are able to keep track of arguments in the round, because if you do not do this, it is really hard to give a compelling MO. The MO relies on being able to identify what is important in the round and what you need to focus on. So if you are not finding a way to flow that works for you, you're not going to get that far because you're probably going to drop stuff. This is trial and error. It took me a really long time to decide how I wanted to flow and what I felt worked for me. But it's definitely something that's important for people to do. And it's important for you to find something that works for you. Third is to communicate with your partner. You should know what the LO is going to say before they get up and say it. You should not be living in a world where you get up for, or your partner gets up for LOC and you are sitting there and you're like, wow, that's a cool off-case argument. I'm glad we're running that. No, ask your partner, communicate with your partner. I think it's intuitively obvious why. It's good to know what's going to get said. It means you can plan for the round more. You can have better round vision because you can better understand what's going to get said in the future. But you're just not a passenger princess. Like, you deserve to have impact on what the op is going to say. You should be able to communicate with your partner about that. And POCs, especially now that people use them for prep time, is a really good time to do that. Also, it means you'll be more prepared to use time effectively during the round, because if you have heard the LOC arguments, or you at least know what direction LOC is going to go in, you are more able to prep MO content. You are more able to extend those arguments while LOC is happening, rather than just having to think and understand the arguments as your partner is saying them. That's for Gov to do, right? They get to hear the arguments for the first time in LOC, but you should work as a partner with your partner. Fourth, listen to LOC as it is happening. I'm not saying flow it word for word, but I am saying understand the claims that are being made and think to yourself, what's missing from this? Not that your partner is bad, but like, what could I add to this? Where could I extend these arguments? What sorts of warrants could I add to these? And even like, what is the most winning thing they are saying? Where are we going to collapse? Where am I going to go with the MO? Because in the LOC, you can throw a lot of stuff at the wall. Your partner can say a lot of things, but they're probably not all going to be winning. And the MO is a speech where you can sort of target down and say, okay, we made like 10 random claims. We're not going to collapse on 10 things. We're going to collapse on 2 or 3 things. What of those are the most likely to be winning, the judge is most likely to find compelling? Or it can be, what gets dropped out of MG? What do I want to take later? So listening to the rest of the round is important. Cool. What do we do when it's time for the actual speech? First, on structure. If you're just learning to MO, I recommend following the flow. It's probably the easiest way to do it. Yeah, you can off-flow MO. It's kind of fun to do. That said, if you are just learning to MO and it is the first time you've ever given the speech, I would certainly suggest following the order that MG picked, even if loosely, right? You maybe don't need to respond to every word out of their mouth. But following the order that they're picking is going to be easier for you. It's going to structure. It's probably going to mean you're likely to hit the on case and the off case. Yeah, you'll probably need to hit arguments that they didn't hit in their speech, but you can go back and do that, and it will be easier to do if you have some sort of baseline structure. A really simple but effective version of the MO does a couple things. One, it beats new offense coming out of the MG, especially if they start flagging it as immediately winning. So if MG gets up and they're like, Elo dropped this argument and we're going to pull it through to PMR and it's really cool and really important, first thing you respond to in the MO should be explaining why they are not going to pull that through to PMR. Either it's not winning, not weighed, not warranted, something. You got it, or just beat the argument. That's the first thing you need to do. The first thing that needs to happen is you need to not have auto voters coming out of MG. Secondly, similar thought applies to PMC. Maybe your LO didn't get to all of PMC. Maybe MG pulled through some PMC warrants and made them stronger. Respond to PMC stuff in the MO. It doesn't have to be super classy. You can be like, I'm going to hit PMC arguments. They make this argument in PMC that says XYZ. I'm going to respond to it real quick. Doesn't have to be gorgeous or eloquent, but just make sure you're responding to that stuff. The MO is the place to just beat that before it becomes a bigger problem in PMR. Because recognize if these things don't get beaten in the MO, the only choice is now your LO and LOR needs to outweigh them. You can no longer respond to them, no longer beat them that way. So it is up to the MO to be putting responses on these things. Third, you have to make sure there are things that are able to be pulled through for your side of the house. This looks like either responding to the MG's responses to LO's off-case arguments. If MG responded to all the stuff in the off-case, you can either respond to their responses, you can add new warrants to your case, especially if they dropped stuff. It's really easy for the MO to get up and say, MG didn't respond to the third off-case argument. Here's like a couple more reasons why it's true. Here's how we're going to weigh that argument. Here's why it's really silly and it loses them the round that MG didn't respond. You can beat them over the head with stuff in the MO. It's really fun. But it's a great time to do that and to just be adding stuff to arguments and ensuring you are set up well going into rebuttals so that there are things for your LO to be able to collapse on. This is, again, my communication is really important. Something I would usually do as a debater when I MO'd is I would say to my partner who was LOing, hey, I'm going to go for XYZ argument at the top of MO and make sure that I really emphasize that. Can we make sure we're on the same page going into op block so that my partner would know, one, they might not need to spend as much time repeating weighing that I'm giving, but two, so that the sort of weighing they are giving is in sync with the arguments and the weighing I'm giving and making sure you're on the same page. It's really disheartening to watch when an MO gets up and says something really good and then LO knifes it in LOR. Just make sure you're talking to each other. It makes that much less likely to happen, and it means your arguments are going to be much more compelling because it seems like you're going to be on the same page. Cool. A couple tips for giving an on-flow MO. Think to yourself, what do we need to do to win the round? Because you are now the last chance to position yourself in a way that you are actually going to be able to meaningfully win the round. This looks like thinking to yourself, what was missing from LOC, or what is missing from the off case that we need to give? What gov arguments must be beat to be able to win the round? It also includes thinking to yourself things like, what is gov likely to get up and say in PMR? Because you can get up in the MO and say, gov is going to collapse on this in PMR. Here's why they're not actually going to do that. And this is a really good way to preempt those ballots from getting said and start taking them out. Secondly is time allocation. You're not going to respond to everything on the flow. There have been 3 speeches and 24 minutes of speech time that have happened before your 8.5-minute speech. So you as the MO are not going to be able to respond to every single argument on the flow. I'm sure there's lots of things we could say in a round. You're not going to be able to say all of them. This means that you need to pick and choose the most important things. This is something that takes a lot of getting used to and is sometimes really hard to do. The biggest tip I have for it is if there is something you think is super important, don't think to myself, oh, I'm going to get it at the end of my speech. Say it at the top. It might not be the prettiest. That's okay. If you have something and you're like, we need to respond to this, we need to beat it, we need to deal with it sufficiently, do it at the top, because if you save it, you're probably not going to save as much time as you think you need, or you'll think you need a different amount of time and things don't necessarily get fully beaten. And then you have the moment in PMR where you're like, oh, I didn't really beat that all the way and I'm really worried about it. Save yourself the stress, put it at the top. Lastly, on filling time, because this is something I've noticed a lot recently, especially if this is something you're struggling with and it gets to the MO and you hit maybe minute 5, minute 6, you're like, I don't really know what else I want to say. Because there's 2 types of people. There are people who have way too many things to say, and there are people for whom it is a struggle. I was a struggle person when I was a novice. It was really hard for me, actually. Sometimes, like, it would hit minute 6, and I'd be like, oh, I don't know where to go from here. So, a couple things you can ask yourself. Are there things I could add to an argument to make it stronger? Could I add examples? Could I add impacts? Could I add warrants? Is there a new argument I could make that's relevant, right? Recognizing the MO. We've been talking about sort of responding, but recognize you are not limited to just what your LO has said. You can also interact with other things or make new arguments in the round. You are not limited to just being sort of derivative or secondary to the claims that come out of LOC. You can also think to yourself, can I explicitly preempt something Gov is going to say? Can I explain why they're not going to win? These are just things you can sort of think about to add more content to your speech if that's something you're struggling with. That's a brief summary of an on-flow MO. Let's talk about MO strategy, because this is a little more fun, and this is why I really like the MO, because there's a lot of fun things you can do with it. You can get pretty fancy. A couple ways you can take the MO. The first is the quote-unquote MO dump, which you'll probably hear a fair amount if you're in APTA spaces. It's just APTA jargon for an MO that adds meaningfully new arguments to the round. It's usually done pretty off-flow or like a flow-off-flow hybrid. It's fun. Why should you do it? Pros and cons. Why should you do it? First, you can overwhelm a prime minister by forcing them to respond in PMR, which necessarily trades off with the time they can spend on collapses, because if you get a PM having to respond line by line to a fairly techy MO dump, that's just time that they cannot spend weighing or explaining a collapse. This is good a couple reasons. One, if they're not as good of a PM, if they're not amazing, they might just drop parts of the MO argument, and you might just win off of that. You MO dump and you make a new argument and you warrant it out and you weigh it in MO, and PM doesn't really respond all the way or doesn't respond to some parts of it, some judges might just vote off of that. So you might just win there, ignoring other arguments on the flow. That's kind of fun. Two, it just trades off with time on collapses, or it trades off with time writing collapses, right? There's also like the psychological thing of if you dump 5 new arguments on a PM while they're writing PMR, they might just not know what to do with it, right? Like, it's confusing. It's a lot of content. But 3, you could also do it as sort of like a tactical fake out. You can make an argument if you don't have that much else to do in MO. You can make an argument that you don't really care about. Like, you know, your LO is going to go for something else in LOR. You don't really care what happens to it. You can spend a minute or two making an argument that PMR thinks they really need to beat because it sounds important, but it's not really where you're winning. You can just waste their time. I don't necessarily recommend doing this, especially if you don't have a great sense of round vision, but it is fun to do, and it is something that you can do with the speech, especially as you get more experience with it. Second big reason to MO dump, you can just get more content on the flow. Just like the way MG can get up and make new Gov arguments in the MG speech, you too can get up and make new op arguments in the MO speech. It's just more content on the flow for your side. I'm not saying just throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks, but like, some judges might like having more content, and it's also just something you can do. Third, you can just differentiate yourself from LO. Sometimes it's perceptually good in rounds where there'll be reasons that you do not want to seem derivative of your leader. Like, it's not necessarily even just about speaks. Sometimes you just want to seem like you are contributing new content to the round, and this is a really great way to do it, especially in rounds where they're not that dense or there isn't that much getting said, and you're kind of like, I don't know how I'm going to fill 8 minutes. Like, my LO is kind of solidly winning already. This is a great round to MO dump. Make 3 or 4 minutes of new arguments at the top of your speech, especially if there's just stuff that hasn't been said that would be good to say. It makes you win harder, which means you will speak higher. It means you will have a better time. As long as you're not being mean to people, seems like a pro. That said, there are a couple of cons to MO dumping that you have to be careful with. The first is that sometimes judges have a really low bar for what a response in PMR needs to look like. So you get the equivalent of, you spent 2 minutes making an argument, and someone gets up in PMR and says, but that's not true. I don't really think that's true. And the judge listens to it and they go, yeah, well, PMR responded, so I don't buy the MO argument. This is not a great feeling to experience. You kind of got to know the judge for it, but just being clear about explaining arguments and explaining warrants for arguments, that they're less likely to be seen as just claims and you are less likely to hit this sort of thing from judges, can be helpful. 2, it can take time away from flow coverage. It's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to many other people. If you get really into giving a new MO argument and suddenly it's like minute 6 and you're like, I got to get through all of these arguments that I need to respond to on the flow. This is a time allocation thing, but just making sure you're being mindful of it and careful of it. Third, smart and good PMs can and will turn arguments in PMR. So if you make a new argument, you have to think a little bit about it first and just think to myself, is this something PMR could get up and turn and then either make it knife my case or make it be just a bad argument I shouldn't have said that ultimately ends up looking bad? It's not the most common thing in the world. It's happened to me personally, and it was a big learning lesson from me. And ever since then, I've been very mindful of it. This is sort of a combination of like knowing who you're hitting, thinking about the arguments you're making, and also something you can do with this that I'll get into more on the next slide is making the argument like still new, but a little less new. So it relies on warrants from the LOC that you're extending or things like that, so that if PMs try to do some of these sneaky things, you can point of order them and be like, that used warrants from the LOC, so it actually wasn't new. It's a little game like that. So what are my tips for a successful MO dump and making sure you're doing it in a way that is going to be good and is going to work for your side? A couple things. One is about connecting it to the LOC. Rather than just going rogue and saying a whole new argument, you can do a couple things. You can add warrants to an existing argument. You can have your LO blip what you want to say in the MO. This is something I've done a lot where I'll have my LO be like, make like a claim and not really say the extent of it, but they'll just make like a 1 or 2 sentence claim. And then I in the MO will spend maybe 30 seconds or 45 seconds explaining the extent of the claim. Or you can straight up lie. Like you can be like, LO said this and I'm extending it. If like PM responds to it and you want to point of order them. I don't really suggest doing this for legal reasons and also because it's bad to lie, obviously, in rounds. That said, it probably will work if you need it to in a pinch, so I feel like I should mention it. My second thing for a successful MO dump is independently weighing these arguments and impacting them. So you have the ability as a part of OpBlock to make arguments into ballots all by yourself. You don't need LO to touch them. So if you want an MO dump, and this is a risky strategy because again, PMR is able to respond to it, but if you want to MO dump a new argument that you think is really compelling and you've talked to your LO and they're like, yeah, this is a good argument, we should go for this, you can set up that argument just like a voter in PMR. So you can say, here is what we tell you. We help the least well off better on our side of the house. Here is why. And you give your new warrants or whatever else it is you're explaining. You give your impacts, you explain why they're important, and you say, Judge, here's a voter for our side of the house. You can do that. Your LO does not need to touch it anymore, and you have now created a successful MO dump that needs to be beaten in the PMR, or else they might lose to it. That's good for you. Third, don't do it just to do it. Sometimes it actually might not be the best strategic choice to MO dump. You might need to prioritize either making responses to things or doing flow cleanup and organization over just making new arguments in the MO. And that's okay. It doesn't make you a worse MO. It doesn't make the round a bad round. Some rounds, it's just not the right setup for it. And similar to that, don't overcommit super early, right? Like you might have come up with really good arguments that you wrote out for yourself during LOC that you want to make at the top of MO. And then you realize there's a ton of other stuff you need to do. That's okay. Be willing to scrap the arguments. Like be willing to say 4 minutes into MG, I'm actually not going to make these arguments at the top of MO. Either they're not relevant anymore. They're just not where I want to go with the round. I need to spend my time on other things. That's totally fine. My last thought on MO dumping is find a time that works for you to plan what you are going to say. For me personally, usually it was during LOC since I didn't like planning out MO dump arguments, like writing out bigger arguments during MG, just because usually I was trying to flow MG pretty intently to make sure I was responding to a lot of it. Some of that might be a personal thing because I was not super great at tracking arguments. If I wasn't flowing them, I would confuse myself. But just find a time that works for you and have a way you do it consistently so you know, okay, I'm going to MO, so I'm probably going to prep at this point in the round. I'm going to listen here. I'm going to write here, just so you know what's going on. It'll make you less stressed and it'll make you more consistent as a debater. Let's talk about off-flow MOs more generally. The off-flow MO is any MO that either goes on a little journey around the flow. I was trying to do a hand motion, but it didn't really work. Or like wanders about, makes some overviews, says some new arguments, doesn't really straight up follow the flow. MO dumping is a type of this, not the only type of MO that can do this. There's a lot of things you can do. You can do that. You can do big, thick overviews at the top. This is something that I think the Optimeta has shifted pretty heavily towards, actually, of people just like at the top of MO being like, I'm going to give 2 overviews. And the overviews are just like, I'm going to out myself with this one. It's just like, what do we care about in this round? I would start my MOs like that all the time. I'd be like, what do we care about? We care about, I don't know, not having a recession in like an econ round, right? You can do stuff like that where you like lump stuff into ballots. And then you can do that of more like rebuttal style MO, where you do that for a lot of your speech, where you sort of lump arguments together, talk about each clash in the round one at a time, and explain why you're winning it. Do like a Gov says this, we say this, here's why this is more important type MO. You do not have to just like line by line go, they say X, we say Y, then they say X, we say Y. You do not have to do that. You can, but you don't have to. Tips for going off flow in the MO. If you're giving overviews at the top, think to yourself, what's the most important issue? What do we care about? What's the most important impact? How do we get that better than Gov? These are the sorts of ways you can go for what might make a good overview or what might be a good thing to talk about at the top. Second, be mindful of the flow. I am very hesitant to recommend anyone ever go fully off flow in the MO, because I think most rounds benefit from at least a little bit of cleanup stuff on the flow. Whether that is hitting stuff from PMC LO miss, hitting one-off weird things in MG that you think might get pulled through, or extending stuff from LOC, or beating specific responses to it. I usually think there is something you need to say in your speech that is tied into the flow in some way. So I would really hesitate to tell anyone to make like a full 8.5 minute off case overview, new argument. That might work. I'm sure there's rounds where it would work and has worked, and someone watching this at some point will be able to disprove me and be like, this was good in this round. Sure, I don't think it's good in the majority of rounds, and it's not something I would recommend, especially to newer debaters, just because I don't think it's always the best strategic choice, and requires a lot of round vision to make work very well, and also just requires a lot of communication with your partner to ensure that they know what you're going to do and they have like a very solid strategy for a rebuttal speech after this. Third, signpost it. Just because you are going off flow and you are making an overview, or you are making a new argument, or you are weighing something, does not mean the flow no longer matters. Please explain to the judge what arguments you are referencing in the round, where they came from, where they apply, why it's relevant. All of this will make you speak higher. It will also just make you easier to understand, easier to keep track of arguments. Judges are people too. So if you are in a round and you are like, this round is kind of hard to flow, I don't really know where I'd put this on my flow, your judge probably has the same question, and the MO is a really good place to get up and explain it to them so that they don't feel confused. And a lot of times, if you are the person that explains to the judge how they should see the round, that means they're more likely to buy your side, because they're like, this person told me how I should see the round. That seems correct. This is also a tip for PMing, because I also have a lot of thoughts on that, but that's an aside. Lastly, focus on weighing stuff. As a part of OpBlock, you have the ability to independently structure and weigh ballots to the judge without your LO having to repeat it 6 minutes later in LOR. You can use that to your advantage, and it's a really powerful tool. Last slide, I promise. I know I've been talking longer than I said I would. A lot of judges assume that MOs are structurally derivative of the LO. You want to break out of this. One, it's just not great. It doesn't feel great to feel like, oh, you're just like following your LO, they tell you what to do, whatever. But two, you will also perform better and give better speeches if you do not believe this about yourself. Because if you do not think that you are structurally derivative to the LO, you are just more likely to make better, independent, stronger arguments, which means that you are more likely to win the round than if you don't do this. A couple tips for how to differentiate. One, if you are still winning on dropped LOC arguments after the MG has already finished, make some new arguments in MO, weigh them for the judge. More ballots on your side of the house means you are more likely to speak higher, and I've been in a lot of rounds like this. Yes, you can get up and repeat LO and be like, LO says, LO says. You can do it, you'll win the round. You will certainly get the 2 to your LO. You will certainly speak lower than you could have if you were making new arguments and you were engaging on like a higher level with the round. Two, sort of secondary to that, be deliberate if you're extending arguments. You can credit your LO and say, LO says this argument, but don't just repeat it. add something to it, either a new warrant, a new impact of it, a new explanation or example of the claim, something to make it a little bit different. And third, prep yourself content either during POCs or during the LO. My strat as a debater was usually to think to myself, what is the LO not saying that I would like to have said or I would have liked to hear in LOC, and fill some of that in with your MO. So if you just think logically, like, are there gaps in the analysis? Are there things I would like to have seen in this speech? Or are there things I think could have been added? And you can tactically to not get up in the MO and go, my LO didn't say, and they should have said, and then say an argument. Don't do that. That's mean to your partner. Do not be mean to your partner. But you can get up and be like, extending on the point my LO made, here are some additional things I would like to add, or some additional nuance or context I would like to add, and go from there in a way that doesn't make you seem like you're not listening to them or you don't care what they said, but in a way where you are adding meaningfully to what they said, and that the judge can pick up like, oh, you're extending the argument. Oh, you're making the argument better. This is the tactful way to do it, and it's something that can help differentiate you. All of that said, that is the end of my rant on the MO. I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has them, or people are welcome to message me. Either way, I'm happy you all came. If anyone has questions, feel free to ask.